So now that we have our login and log out, we can allow our users to log in and log out. The piece that's still missing is the ability for the user to identify who they are, to make sure that if they walk up to this computer and they log into our application, that they know they are themselves and maybe not a spouse or a friend or somebody who randomly stole their computer and used it. So how do we present some information onto the screen next to the log out button to be able to say, this is who you are as a user? Now, there's a lot of different methods we could use. Some people may consider, well, I just come into my layout again, and I can add some more code here under the if authenticated. And in a normal simplistic world, that would work, but how do you get that user information here, and how do you present them with their name instead of it being something like a username? So to do that, we actually have to incorporate some newer technology, something that we haven't learned up to this point, and those are referred to as partial views. And what a partial view is it's just like a view. It has an action, and it's usually part of a controller, and it presents HTML. But instead of presenting a full page worth of HTML, it presents just a chunk or a section of HTML, or maybe a snippet. And that little piece or fragment of HTML is then presented to the user as this is some specific information. And the nice thing about partial views is that they are reusable. So if you build it once, you have the ability to use it in multiple places of your application. So to create a partial, we'll start by going into our action or our account controller. And when I open this, all of my code's really open and I can see everything. So what I like to do is I like to go up to Edit, Outlining, and choose Collapse to Definitions. And by doing that, it collapses all of my functions, all of my actions, into just single one-liners, and it's just the function definition itself. And that way I can see all my code and know that it exists, but if I don't want to actually be staring at it right now, I can just collapse it down to those definitions. So we're going to start by creating an action, so public action result, and I'm going to call this my user nav partial. The way that you return a partial view versus a view is simply to do return partial view. And what that does is it tells ASP.NET to only render the view as a partial and not to include the underscore layout as part of the render process. So that way we only get back that snippet of code. So we have our partial view. Now we need to be able to do a few steps here. We need to capture a logged in user. We need to get the, get user information from the database, build our user nav partial view model, and then send the view model to the partial view. All right, so let's kind of work a little bit backwards. Let's figure out what we want to actually put into our partial view first. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to choose add view, and we get the same add view dialog that we've seen before. It pulls in the name of our partial. We'll leave this as empty without a model because we haven't defined a model. And because of some work I did earlier, this is already checked. But if it's not checked, you want to check the option that says create as a partial view. And this is important because what happens is when you check this, you'll notice that the user layout and the reference script libraries options get disabled. So what happens when you generate a partial view is nothing more than an empty document, because we decide what HTML we want to send to the user. Now, in the context of where we're putting this, this is going to end up inside of our nav bar in between two li tags, and it's going to be a link. So what we'll do here is we'll just start out with a basic a tag, and we'll do href, and we'll figure out our ref in a moment. And then what we want to do is put in here, what data do we want to present? So in my mind, I'd like to do probably something like parentheses, and then put in the user's first name and last name in between those parentheses. So we'll end up needing at, and then we can do model.firstname space at model.lastname. And the model will be our view model, but we haven't actually defined that yet. And so what we'll need in our view model is at least two properties, one for first name and one for last name. Let's go ahead and jump into our Solution Explorer And let's focus on models for a minute. So we'll go under View Models and Account. I'm going to right click and choose Add Class. And this will be our user nav partial view model. So this is creating a class just like any other. And we'll start out with those two properties. They'll both be strings. So we have first name, string, last name. Now we may also want to capture the ID of our user, so we can do prop int ID, because that may be helpful for us in the future jumping to another screen. So we'll go ahead and do those three. And you'll notice here that we didn't bring in a lot of user data, because for this partial we don't need a lot of user data. So that's kind of the nice part about building different view models for different views, is that you're only packing up into memory the data that you need, and you're not carrying around a lot of additional data. Let's go ahead and we'll jump back to our account controller, and let's start working our way back toward the view. So first we need to capture the logged in user. Now to get that, I'm going to first declare a string, and I'm going to call it username. And then we're going to say the username equals, and if we go to this, which is our controller, the controller has a property called user. And this user property gets set by that forms authentication and the authentication manager within ASP.NET MVC. Now this user property has additional properties of its own, one being identity. This property then has additional properties of its own, and the one that we're looking for is name. Now, what this name is it's the username that the user uses to log in. So we're going to use that to do a lookup. So here we'll say get user information from the database. So we're going to need a DB context to connect to our database, and we'll need to wrap that in a using statement. So we'll use our WSAD DB context. I'm just going to call it context. So we'll need to create a new instance of that, and we'll end up building our partial view while we're active inside the context. So I'll bring that line of code in here. So first we need to do our search for user, and the user that we're going to get back is going to be one of our DTOs. So we're going to be looking at models.data.user is the object we're going to get back, and this will be our logged in user. And the way that we get it from the database is that we're going to say context.users.first or default. So we're looking for one user that matches this username. Now, if we did something like where, we could do a where, but we're going to get back a collection. So first or default basically says, give me back the first one that matches, and don't give me back a full collection, because we really just need one object. Now, if you look around the internet, you may see people do things like this. So X will be my row. So I'll say X dot username equals, and then we called ours username all lowercase, dot first or default. And what that does is it says grab all users where the username equals our username value, and then take the first or default. Perfectly valid code. Functions very well. There's really no complaints I have, except for it's just typing extra stuff into your computer. You can actually take this conditional, this lambda expression, and you can feed it right to the first or default action. So you can put it right there inside of the first or default, and it functions just the same. It just simply says grab the first or default of username. Now, first or default means that it's going to grab the first item from the result set, or it's going to give me back the default object. Now, most objects' default values are null. So what this does for me is it says if I find a user with that matching username, it's going to give me back that user object. If it doesn't find it, it'll give me back null. And then I can do a check to say, is the logged in user null? And if it is, well, then that means that that's not a real username. There's something wrong, and we need to run away as fast as possible. So we can simply say if logged in user equals null, then I'm just going to break out of here and return content of an empty string. No need to complicate things. We don't want to give away any information, so let's just set that to an empty string and be done with it. That would basically mean that nothing is rendered out to the web page, or at least nothing's rendered out from our partial, so our partial doesn't load. Now, if it isn't null, which would be the exception case, then we say that we need a user nav partial view model, And let's actually declare this up here outside the using statement, because if we declare it inside the using statement, then it'll be caught up in the scope of the using statement. So we'll call this our user nav VM. And then down here in the build step, we can say user nav VM equals new user nav VM and do that inline initialization. And then we can just copy the properties that we need from logged in user. Now, actually for clarity, I'm going to change this to be user DTO. Just so that way we can see what we're working with and what we're talking about. So we'll pull first name here, last name is user.DTO.lastName, and the ID is the same user.DTO.ID. All right, so we build our view model, and then the last step is that we simply return that view model to our partial. All right, so we've got those pieces in place now. Now the last step is that we need to actually make our partial view strongly typed. So I'm going to highlight my partial view or my view model name, and I'm going to flip back over to my partial. So now I need to put @model space and my view model. Now it's going to come up with a red squiggle, and that's because the view doesn't know where this view model lives, so we have to actually help it. So we're going to say models.viewModels.account. It may need the full path. So we'll need to give it WSAD-app1. No, still doesn't like that. All right, so the other option is we can jump into the view model and, oh, it's underscore. That's probably our issue. And I can just grab this entire namespace and copy it and jump back here, and basically everything before user nav partial view model, and paste that in there. And you'll know it works when your model class ends up turning blue. So we'll go back to underscore layout, and it's really up to you where you want to put it, but I'm going to put it after the logout. So I'm going to put an li tag, and then I'm going to do @html dot, and what we want to use this time is something to push the partial in. Now there's actually two approaches that you can use. There is a partial call, and the partial call takes just the name of the partial view itself, so just that view, and it renders it straight into the page. So if you had static HTML that you wanted to render, or if you have a partial that uses the same model as your parent action or view, you can just use render partial. In our case, we actually have an action that needs to be called in order to get the user information to be presented. So instead of calling html.action or .partial, we're going to call html.action. And then here we will pass in the action that we want to use. So for us, it's user nav partial is the name of our action, and that lives in the account controller. So what this will do is it will render that partial into our page. Now, keep in mind, inside of our view, we don't actually have anything here for a tag link. We'll build that in the next video, and then we'll come back and make that adjustment here. So let's go ahead and run and see what we have. All right, and then we will click login to log in. We'll put our username in, our password, and hit login. And there we go. So now we have our navigation, our logout, and our partial rendering out our name. So now we can see who we are and make sure that we should be who we are, logging into our application.